All right, everybody. Welcome to our Scripture Notes webinar today. I am Oak Norton, and this is our special guest today, Bron Kimball. Bron, welcome.
Thanks. So really excited to be here with you and with your
I'm
audience. Scripture, scriptorians, scripture studies are, this is the kind of people I love talking to because they get it. They have a background, they have an understanding of the life of Jesus, at least what known in the canon, and your site exposes them to some more documents beyond that. So really excited to be here.
That's
Different
awesome.
audience. Yeah.
So anybody that has this is a live event, and anybody that has questions for Bron, feel free to punch the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can type those in as we go, and he'll address those at the end. He's got a little presentation first, and then we'll take questions. And of course, you can use the chat to communicate with each other, but it'd be helpful if you put your questions in the Q&A area. So. With that said, a little about Bron. Bron is an accomplished engineer, innovator, and technology leader. Early in his career, he developed the flagship security product at LiveView Technologies based in American Fork, Utah, and saw his product reach over $1 billion in market share within a few years. Bron was chief engineer at LVT for several years before moving into leadership within the company's software and technology. And more recently, Bron has shifted his focus to the entertainment industry, serving as the technical product manager at Angel Studios, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of or should have by now. A growing interest in the life work of his late uncle, Glenn Kimball, has led Bron into a collaborative effort with two of his family members to research and write a book series on deeper aspects of the life of Jesus Christ and his closest family and followers. The Kimball trio includes Bron, his brother Ben, and their mother Pamela. Uncle Glenn was a lifelong researcher and popular radio show guest and lecturer on ancient manuscripts and religious texts. Bron has since become fascinated by the surprising ways in which both study and science can unite with religion to teach us about the world we live in. Bron has since become fascinated by the surprising ways in which both study and science can unite with religion to teach us about the world we live in and God's plan for us. He and his wife, Sydney, are the proud parents of four. So, Bron, I'm really excited to hear your presentation today. I've read your book and love it. I think there's a lot of great information there for people to really get a more complete perspective on the life of Christ. And I'm just really excited to have everybody get an opportunity to hear what you have to share.
All right. Thanks. So thanks for that introduction. When you told me that you're reading my book, this was a week ago, a couple weeks ago. I was really excited to hear, like, hey, Oak's reading my book. And sure enough, you had some questions that I knew you'd read. Yeah, I knew you'd gotten pretty far in the book because of the questions you're asking. But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully that works fine.
Yep, it's up. So feel free to, I'll just mute myself for now, and you just take off. And when the presentation's done, we'll hit some questions.
Sure. And if you want to stop me at any point, Oak, with a question of your own, feel free to unmute, chime in.
Okay.
Um, yeah, no problems with that. Okay, so topic of the presentation today is called Threads of the Holy Family. What you're seeing there is a Phoenician ship. The Phoenicians, anciently, we're talking a few hundred BC, owned the largest trade fleet in the entire world. They were trading up and down um, the west coast of Europe, as well as throughout the entirety of the Mediterranean Ocean. They knew specific shipping and trade routes and sea routes more than just about any other group or civilization. It's very likely that they are at least a combination of the tribe of Asher from northern Israel, if not largely the tribe of Asher. Um, but these people were conquered by the Romans. They were conquered by the Romans. All of their trade ships commandeered, their trade routes, their trade secrets. Their secrets were kept so tight. If they caught somebody following them, they would intentionally scuttle their ship, knowing that their trade routes were so profitable and productive they could just get a new ship and it'd be fine. Um, But when the Romans acquired this fleet and this knowledge, it opened up their trade an unbelievable amount. Connected them to the Silk Road. It connected them to the shores of Britain. And so that's an important note. We're going to circle back to that later. But what we're looking at here is a Phoenician ship, state-of-the-art transportation in ancient times. A lot of my presentation today is going to use our own book. This is a book I wrote with my brother and my mother. It was released about a year and a half ago. It's called Hidden Stories of Jesus in Britain, and you can see our link down there, hiddenstoriesofjesus.square.site, if you want to learn more about this book. We're going to use bits and pieces of this book. We're not going to summarize it by any means. We're going to cover just how it ties into the Holy Family and some threads of the Holy Family that we're going to chase down and follow. And I'm going to focus on two threads today. One thread is the relationships to Jesus, his ancestry, his family relationships, and even his posterity to a degree, or the family's posterity, right? The Holy Family's posterity. Jesus did have, believe it or not, like everybody else, extended family. We're also going to look at paper trails, cold hard documents. We're going to look at religious beliefs of a few different ancient peoples. We're going to be reviewing some politics and some powers at play during those times, and of course, historical documents themselves. These historical documents have to be looked at correctly, and I want to start off with a frame of mind of how to look at ancient texts. I think this unlocks a lot of anyone here's ability to review apocryphal texts, pseudepigrapha, and anything like that. Any kind of extra biblical text, you've got to see it with the right lens. 1 second. Live in Utah, it's really dry climate. So one way to properly interpret the paper trails is just to understand their source. Where did these historical documents come from? The Bible is fairly straightforward. We have some ancient texts at the bottom there. They got compiled together in a council called the Council of Nicaea, where a bunch of high-ranking bishops decided on what they were going to move forward with. And once they made that choice, they really protected that translation. They took care, they made sure that it was not altered or messed with. They're all accountable to each other, and eventually that becomes the Bible as we know it today. However, not every text at the Council of Nicaea was accepted. Some were rejected. They weren't popular enough. Someone didn't like it. It's just hard to say. It was kind of a popular vote, but some texts did not make it, and they enter a collection I'm going to refer to as the lost texts. And these lost texts included some rejected from the council, but some that just never showed up. They just didn't make it. Either they weren't prominent enough or they weren't known enough. Some of these texts we've discovered in our time that predate the Council of Nicaea. But these lost texts have to be viewed because they did not get the protection that the manuscripts that passed through the Council of Nicaea received. And so what they got is they got a biased translation by the people who had them. For the most part, they were used to give certain paradigms or certain theologies an extra boost or to reinforce a certain people. Some of those groups include the Romans, the Gnostics, the Ascetics in the East, the Orthodox in the East, or even the Knights Templar later on. So when we get these texts, these people, they transcribed and preserved these ancient texts, but they added their own bias in. If you can take a look and understand what their bias was, you can peel that back and see much of the original text. And I believe you can see 80-90% of what the original text actually was. However, the original text almost entirely has been lost. It's very rare, very difficult, even for the Bible, to find actual, genuine original text. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls is very much an exception to the rule. It's why it's such a treasure discovery, right? We have texts direct that are super ancient. We typically don't have that luxury when we're looking at history. So a lot of those translations end up being what we have as the apocryphal text or extra biblical text. Ooh, that's a hard one to say. So I hope that's making sense to you, Oak, and to your audience, that if we can understand these groups here, we can peel back what's likely in those original lost texts and what they originally intended to say. And we can get something more authentic out of them. And one of those groups we're going to look at a lot today is the Celtic people. And my wife actually had the suggestion, you need to put a map up so people know who the Celts are. Because she didn't know when we were first, when I was first diving into some of this stuff. But the Celts anciently is everything you see green here. They were massive, a massive group, massive civilization that covered most of Europe. Around the time of Christ, we're going to focus on kind of the left side there, the Gauls and the Britons were kind of the focus of the Celtic cultures and the Celtic religions. We also have in Ireland up there in the top left, the Gaels, and in Scotland, the Picts. These guys are Celtic adjacent, I would say. But these people are one of those filters that we're going to look at, especially as we get to the end of our presentation. I'm going to talk a lot about some of the surviving texts that we get from these people, who generally, according to the Romans, wrote very, very little down. There's just not a lot of direct writing. It's really hard to see who these people were past the medieval ages. What came through the medieval ages, however, is a depiction of the Druids and the Celtic people on the left side there. You can see a Druidic priest. He's holding a knife. He's got a stern look on his face. The tradition is that they were very sacrificial, including human sacrifice. So kind of a dreary look there on the left. But what I think is more accurate based on the evidence I've looked at least is on the right. They were a little bit more ceremonial, a little bit more, dare I say, mosaic. You can even see on both sides the white clothes they're wearing, the vestures. It's our argument, my argument, and many others that the Celtic people had or practiced the patriarchal faith very similar to the law of Moses. In fact, they had lots of elements of the law of Moses, but they had the gospel in its original form back in BC times. This is before Jesus Christ. Right down to the vestments that the priest, the archpriest would wear during specific ceremonies and the ceremonies they would perform. Some of the things they shared is very many, a lot of aspects of the law of Moses. They had the concept of atonement, the concept of sacrifice for remittance of sins, and they also prophesied about a savior, a God who would come and perform the ultimate sacrifice that made all of their current animal sacrifices legitimate. They had very much a temple worship ceremony. And if anyone's familiar with the Ancient Tradition podcast, you can kind of delve into what I'm talking about here, but I'm talking about those kinds of things. We'll talk more about it here later as we dive into their beliefs a little bit more specific. Later on in the presentation, they definitely believed in a spiritual afterlife. They had the tree of life, they had covenants, they even had the concept of the tree of knowledge. They had a three-person Godhead. One, the creator of the past, two, the spirit of the present, and three, the savior of the future, who would bring about the resolution of atonement. And by the way, that guy's name in their lore in Druidic mythology, his name was Isis. And that's not a joke. His name was Isis. It's right there. When you look at some of these figures through the medieval lens, you're going to get all kinds of strange mythologies and legends and concepts. But when you look at the oldest traditional Druidic practices, they talk about the savior of the future, this god of the future, Isis. Julius Caesar at one point said, and this is the man, the Roman general who invaded Gaul and tried to invade Britain, got very far through that. Reporting back to the Senate, he said, the Druids teach that by no other way than the ransoming of man's life by the life of a man is reconciliation with the divine justice of the immortal gods impossible, or possible. That's in Gallic. I have the source there. And as I go through these slides, you'll see sources of where I find some of this stuff. But what I believe Julius Caesar was doing here was trying to paint a picture of a partial truth, but paint a picture that these guys were barbaric and human sacrificers to justify his wars and conquests of them, a very common practice of the Romans to call someone a barbarian so they could conquer them. But I do believe he was onto something by saying they believed in this idea of atonement. A few other researchers, just to back up a little bit of what I'm saying, we have Sir Norman Locke here. I confess, I am amazed the similarities we have come across, talking about the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Celtic people. We have Edward Davies. I must confess that I have not been the first in representing the Druidical as having had some connection with the patriarchal religion. W.M. Stukely says, I plainly discern the religion professed by the ancient Britons was the simple patriarchal faith. Now, why are we talking about this? I want to build up a context for ancestry of the Holy Family. Now, we have three wise men who come to Jesus's birth from the east. I don't think the anomaly of the wise men was unique to the east. I think the Druids were essentially magi also, and that they had prophecies of the Savior. They knew he was coming. They were watching for his coming. And I believe the Druids in Britain were not the only ones, but there were groups all over the world who were anticipating the Savior's arrival. It just so happens that out east they were positioned right to see the star and to come see Jesus at his birth. So what does it have to do with the Holy Family here, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus? Well, I believe that the people of Britain, of ancient Britain, held on to those beliefs for a very long time, even up to the time Jesus was born. They likely were aware of the star and of his birth, and to some degree. What we have here is actually not Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. Right here, we actually have Saint Anna, her husband Joachim, who are parents of the Virgin Mary, is the young girl depicted there. And these two individuals are the grandparents of Jesus. Sorry, I keep looking over here because I got Oak's picture over here, so I keep thinking I'm talking to Oak. But Saint Anna is the important one I wanted to talk about because according to Celtic traditions, she is from the British Isles. And according to the Roman Catholic or the Catholic tradition, she was from Judea. And of course, that makes sense historically because the Catholics and the British on the onset of the Roman Catholic or the Holy Roman Empire were at odds. They were literally enemies. The idea that Jesus's ancestry would originate from Britain was not tolerable at that time. But their traditions, the Celtic traditions, still stand, and they say that she was from Cornwall, specifically. Celtic tradition holds that Anna was part of the Juice, a family line, which means the knowers or the wise ones. It was a royal lineage. And in fact, they have a quote here of how they described her, a princess from a Celtic family in Britain. She was a very wise and graceful person, but also a person of authority. So here we have Saint Anna, not only just an average Celt, but she's a royal Celt, right? She's the Britons, the Celts, particularly in Britain, were in multiple kingdoms, and she was at least a princess in one of those kingdoms. Most likely again in southwestern Britain, that's in Cornwall. So much so that actually even in the Catholic traditions, they describe after Mary is given over to the temple because what happened was Saint Anna and Joachim, they were barren into their old age. Very similar to the story of Elizabeth and Zachariah, the high priest, and John the Baptist. They prayed to God to have a child. And in their old age, St. Anna did conceive and had the Virgin Mary, and they dedicated her to a life for the Lord. Joachim himself was a Jew. He was from Bethlehem, and so they took their young daughter, Mary, through the trade routes established by the Phoenicians and controlled at the time by the Romans, who they were in massive friendly trade with at the time, to the temple in Jerusalem and dedicated her life to live there. And in Catholic tradition, St. Anna then retires to her home island, is what they say. Her refuge island. And here in in Cornwall, we have an island that was anciently known as Lam Anna. It's today known as Low Island, but anciently it was Lam Anna, which the translation of that in Welsh was Church of Anna. And in the site, the land next to the island is also known as Lam Anna. And the traditions, if you guys were here for Chris Kimball's presentation on the traditions of Jesus in Britain, one of the traditions was that Jesus would come and visit his grandmother here on this island. There's a place named after Isa. Isa is the name of Jesus known internationally. Anywhere outside of Jerusalem or of Judea, Jesus was known by his Aramaic name, Isa. So not only have this island, but we have the Celtic traditions claiming St. Anna came from there, and even the Catholic tradition does have some supporting evidence that St. Anna was from Britain. So she is connected to these people who anticipated the coming of the Savior. Now, when we get to the Holy Family, we have Mary, who comes from the temple. She was raised in the temple her whole life, is given by the temple patrons over to the hand of Joseph the carpenter. And Joseph the carpenter and her have a son. His name's Jesus. Of course, Jesus doesn't share blood with Joseph directly, but he does share blood with his mother, Mary. And this is the traditional view of the Holy Family. But what I want to point everyone's attention to is that the Holy Family probably looks something more like this. There was more than just Jesus. Joseph the carpenter was likely older, thus the gray hair. He was, according to the sources we have, a widower. There are many apocryphal texts that back up that verify the idea that he was a widower who had children of his own. They were all older than Jesus at the time that they were married. So we have teenagers, we have young kids here being included in the Holy Family, membership of the Holy Family, immediate members. The family probably looks something like this. And if you need any verification of what I'm saying, there's references there at the bottom to scriptures in the New Testament. They talk about the brothers of Jesus, the sisters of Jesus. They talk about their names. We can get a lot of these names come from scripture directly. James, Joseph, Simon, all brothers mentioned as brothers of Jesus. What's interesting, though, is that a lot of those came from a previous marriage from Joseph the carpenter, who was likely a widower. But I do believe that the Virgin Mary and Joseph at least had one child together. His name was Judas. Now, there may have been more children than this, but these are the ones we can confirm through the sources that we have. So Jesus has a little brother named Judas, and they actually do share blood through Mary. There are, of course, a few apocryphal texts down there, the Infancy Gospel of James, History of Joseph the Carpenter, fascinating texts. Again, you got to know who brought them to you. What bias are we looking at to really understand those texts? But this whole family, they get raised in a city called Nazareth. They're brought up in Nazareth under the hand of Joseph the carpenter. He's a carpenter by trade. What's interesting is that people think of Nazareth as some backwater village. No one wants to be there. It grows small. You're from a small town that no one's heard of. What good thing can come of Nazareth, right? As the scripture says. What's interesting, to add a little bit more of the politics to this picture, is Nazareth was more likely, or very likely, a settlement for Roman employees. These are people who were contractors for the Roman Empire to build Roman projects. There was a major Roman project around the time Jesus was being raised as a kid. And that project was the port of Caesarea. The port of Caesarea was a project dictated directly by the Roman Emperor himself. He was building a palace for himself there. He was building a massive state-of-the-art dock for trade. This port was going to connect the Roman Empire and the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea to the Silk trade route of the East. It was also really close to Rome's moneymaker in Jerusalem, the Temple of Solomon, or the Second Temple of Solomon. And so they put every resource possible into this place, and Nazareth was just a straight line inland. So they would probably do shifts, weeks at a time, of working in Caesarea, going home and staying in Nazareth. So it was a lot of motion going on there between those two places. And Jesus and his dad, Joseph the carpenter, Another translation of carpenter, by the way, in the Bible, Oak, another translation for that is architect, which maybe elevates this notion of, just your standard wood shaver carpenter. Architect, a little bit more prominent, a little bit more responsibility. Um, and there's an apocryphal text that talks about Joseph the carpenter and Jesus working on the throne, the hearth of the throne, in fact, the base that the throne would be mounted to in this palace at the top middle there that you see. And Joseph the carpenter was so fixated on making sure that it looked right, that it was beautiful, that it was ornate, that it was structurally what it needed to be, that he goofed one of the dimensions. And by the time they brought it to the palace, it was to fit between two low stone walls. He was supposed to nest it in there and mount it to that base. And when they went to mount it in, to slide it in, it didn't fit. It was too big. He goofed one of the measurements. And of course, panic ensues. They're on a timeline, they're on a crunch. The Roman Empire is going to come see in just a few days. They cannot just cut it. They don't have, precision saws back then. They can't start over, there's not enough time. Joseph the carpenter's panicking, and Jesus calms him down and says, "Don't worry, Father. This will be taken care of. Let's just move forward. Trust me." So they go to push it in, and it just magically fits in. It just resizes itself and fits right in snug. That's a fun story.
Bron,
Yeah.
is that from the history of Joseph the Carpenter that you mentioned earlier, or do you know where that's found?
Um, Ooh, I forget exactly which apocryphal text. There's hundreds, as you know. History of Joseph the Carpenter is not the one that talks about the throne room part per se.
Okay,
The next slide, we're going to talk about all about the history of Joseph the Carpenter apocryphal text. It's magnificent.
cool.
But I can't
Okay,
remember off the top of my head. Good question, Oak. I'll look it up for you.
okay.
So during this time while they're working on the port of Caesarea, they finish the throne room. Um, on his way back one day, Joseph the carpenter, in his old age, he falls ill. Um, and he's worried because he's leaving behind a family of a bunch of kids still. Jesus himself is around the age of 15, so he's got some older brothers and sisters. He's got some younger, at least Judas. Um, but he falls ill, and he walks home. And the quote, I'm going to read some passages here from the history of Joseph the Carpenter, and this comes straight from the history of Joseph the Carpenter apocryphal text. I'm going to paraphrase some of it because it's very wordy, very descriptive. He says a lot of things, but it says, when Joseph became ill, he went to the temple to pray to be delivered from the terrors of death. When he got home, he felt ill and weak, and Jesus said, "I wept." My mother asked if Joseph must die, and I told her that it must be so. I sat at his head and Mary at his feet. Mary felt his feet and legs and found them cold as ice. My brothers and sisters were summoned. Lydia, my oldest sister, lamented, and so did all. I looked at the south of the door and saw the angel appointed to take him at his death and other angels. Joseph saw them and feared. I rebuked them, and the angels fled, except for one who was behind the door. I prayed for protection for the soul of Joseph. And when I had said amen, my mother answered me in the language of the inhabitants of the heavens of Michael and Gabriel. The choir and the angels came. Numbness and panting seized Joseph. The angel appointed to take him at his death was timid, and arose and went outside and I arose and went outside and bade him to go in and do his appointed work. And Joseph died at sunrise. Now the history of Joseph the carpenter is quite lengthy on the passing of Joseph, very dramatic. There's a lot of things, a lot of extra pomp and circumstance, and that's due to the Roman Catholics, who primarily were the ones to bring us that text, who were very descriptive about when someone dies and what they believed and testify of. Nevertheless, I think this story bears some merit and fits together nicely with a lot of other pieces we have. For example, Joseph the carpenter, as soon as Jesus starts his ministry, he's gone, right? He's never mentioned again. Um, that's one aspect to consider. What's interesting is Joseph's fears were not without reason. He definitely was leaving behind a family. So the question becomes, who protects and provides for the family after Joseph the carpenter dies? There are still young kids involved. And in Jewish law, it was the nearest of kin adult male would take over the guardianship of the family. Who was the nearest kin adult male? Joseph himself had no brothers, no uncles, no grandparents. He was an older man himself. All of his family had already passed. Mary, same story, was an only child. Her father, I mean, stricken in years when she was born, was not around. There really was very few options left for nearest of kin adult male, but Mary did have an uncle. This is the brother of Saint Anna. And this brother lived primarily in Britain or was from Britain, just like Anna was. He was part of the royal family there. In fact, he inherited the royal family's trade, their business, which was the tin and lead trade, the tin and lead mines and trade with the Roman Empire there in Cornwall. So all of the tin mines in Cornwall and all of the lead mines in the Mendip Hills area, a little bit west or a little east, they were all owned by him and his family. He inherited all of that. And so he was a very wealthy man, very prominent, very well connected with the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire depended on all these metals for bronze. If anyone doesn't know, copper and tin are combined to make bronze. You need a little bit of tin, and tin is extremely rare, especially in the ancient days. They would just It was just unheard of. Cornwall was one of the few places. Lead, of course, was a soldering compound. It was used throughout Rome to make their baths and aqueducts and all that stuff. Um, so very, very huge business that he inherited, and he was the next closest male relative. So I believe that this man, whose name was Joseph, brother of Anna, becomes the guardian of the Holy Family. In the scriptures, we know him as Joseph of Arimathea. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Joseph of Arimathea here because he's key to understanding the Holy Family. I mean, absolutely key, at least up into that point where Joseph the carpenter passes, again, around the age of 15 for Jesus when that happened. But hopefully you recognize these two scenes. We have on the left Jesus teaching at the temple at age 12, and we have on the right Joseph of Arimathea begging for his body after the crucifixion. And I would pose a question to the audience. How are these two events, even possible or even probable at all? How did they make any sense? I just think that the one on the left is just not likely without Joseph of Arimathea being involved as a family member, and the one on the right is likely impossible. And the reason for that is, do we really think that Mary and Joseph just leave Jesus in Jerusalem for 3 days? I mean, the kid's 12. I wouldn't leave my 12-year-old in a big city for more than like 3 minutes before I'm starting to panic of like, where is he? Where'd he go? Is he okay? Um, let alone 3 days. That just seems astounding to me. Is there really no adult with him? Where is he staying for those 3 days? Who's giving him food, shelter? I think these are important questions to ask. I don't think Joseph and Mary would have just left him in Jerusalem. What it does make sense is if Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the family and he has a position there in Arimathea, which is very close to Jerusalem. And as the scriptures say, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin, so he probably had a house in Jerusalem itself. Then now it all makes sense. He stayed with his uncle, his great uncle, Joseph. And they probably weren't worried at all until he was late showing up, maybe at a predetermined time, 3 days. And that's when they start to panic and run back through each town. They probably go straight to Arimathea to see where he's at and then go on to Jerusalem, and they eventually find him where he had convinced his uncle to let him keep teaching because that's what he's supposed to be doing. On the right, I believe this scenario to be almost impossible because in Roman law, only immediate family members are allowed to request the body of the deceased, including the executed. I don't see how it's possible, but that this man who's just a wealthy disciple asks the body and Pilate just gives it over to this guy. I just don't see that happening. Let alone, I don't understand where the Sanhedrin are when in their practice, and I have the link here, the Mishnah Sanhedrin on the top right, their law and their protocol was to bury criminals in a common criminal field, unmarked. And Jesus, I mean, they were foaming at the mouth to get Jesus laid in some unmarked grave and be forgotten, right? That's all the Sanhedrin wanted was Jesus to disappear and be forgotten. Not not get requested by some rich guy and put in his family tomb to have the honor and dignity of being buried in that way, um, not being recognized as a criminal. So where's the Sanhedrin running to Pilate, running to Joseph of Arimathea and saying, no, that is not what you're supposed to do. That's not what's happening. This guy's being buried um, with every other criminal. And I think the only answer to that is because Joseph of Arimathea was within Roman law to ask it, to ask for that body. Um, I also, a lot of Christians would say that, well, Joseph of Arimathea, as a member of the Sanhedrin, was assigned to go get the body to take it over to the common criminal field, and he just didn't do it. He just kind of rebelled. And I would say that's insane. The Sanhedrin should have ran him over, right? Um, but they don't, and I think it's because they couldn't. There was also Judaic custom, Jewish custom for family to request the body. So without Joseph of Arimathea being a family member, a close family member, I don't think these scenarios make sense. If he is a close family member, then he's the one that takes over after Joseph the carpenter dies. I think those two things just go together. And why is he not stated as a family member? I think it's for safety purposes. In the New Testament, they did not want people to be associated with the Holy Family because anyone who was executed, as we'll talk about here in a second. So some important points about this man, Joseph. I have on the map there on the right approximately where Arimathea was. It's in a place known as Ramah or Ramallah today. As you can see, it's a straight shot to the left over to the port of Jaffa or Joppa, where the main sea trade hub for all of Judea was. I believe this is where his Phoenician ships would land. And then it's a straight shot down to Jerusalem or up to Galilee and the Silk Road area in Caesarea. It was a central spot. And I think that's why they said that he's of Arimathea. They're relating him to the central hub of trade. He most likely had a house in Jerusalem also, being a member of the Sanhedrin. So it's our contention that he was one of the wealthiest and most connected people alive at the time due to his owning of the tin and lead mines, the most lucrative metals trade in the world. No question there. Arimathea was a pivotal trade access region, as I have there. Also, counselor, the word counselor that was translated from Greek in Jerome's Bible, that Greek word is the same word for senator. And by counselor, it means one who sits in council, like with a group. But really, the translation is senator. And the only senators were Roman at the time. There's no Jewish senators. There's no other country that has a republic. So there's the verses there. Luke and Mark call him this word, senator, which also can be translated as decurion. And really, senator is the strongest translation. Decurion's the next. Counselor is like the loosest, weakest translation, which is maybe why they used it, why Jerome used it. But the more specific one is senator. Now, all the Celtic traditions, including Gildas, who lived in about 500 AD, referred to Joseph of Arimathea as a specific type of Roman, which was a nobilis decurio. Again, we have that translation of decurion. And a decurio or a decurion is someone who's in charge of procurement of something. And it's the same root word, decure and procure. In other words, they were a member of the Senate, and all decurions were members of the Senate, who was given a specific task or region of influence, kind of like we do with senators today, within the Roman Empire. So number 4, nobilis decurio, a senator in charge of specific trade. Number 5, what's Joseph's assigned trade? Is the one he owned himself. Okay, when the Roman Empire assimilated the Phoenician Empire, they did not assimilate the Britons. And so he gets assigned by the Roman Empire to come help them orchestrate this trade that they now have. Or his family does, and he inherits it. And so we have this massive tin and lead trade coming through Britain that Joseph of Arimathea is orchestrating on behalf of the Roman Empire. So if they that should paint a picture of who this guy is. I mean, when they say He's some rich disciple. He was some rich disciple, that's for sure. But I think he was much more than that. He was connected to the family directly. And I believe that opens up a world of possibilities from the time Jesus is 15 to the time Jesus is 30. We have 15 years under the guardianship and mentorship. Again, the person who inherits the family's guardianship after a father, they're assigned to help specifically the boys be raised as men, to mentor them, to train them. Um, and 15 years under this man, you can only imagine the possibilities there. And this is where we get to the tradition that Jesus most likely visited Britain. I think he absolutely visited Britain. There's just no question. Joseph of Arimathea is conducting this trade. He's responsible for it. He's going to Britain frequently to oversee his operations. He's in charge. He's responsible for these kids. They're traveling with him. There's just very little question of that. And that's why there's so much silence about the Holy Family in the New Testament. People are asking Jesus, "Hey, what's your tax status? Like, where'd you come from? Who taught you letters?" Wait, aren't you like the carpenter's son or something? They're pulling back this distant memory. It's because Jesus wasn't around at the time. Joseph had access to the largest trade ship fleet in the world of Phoenician ships that could traverse open ocean. And here on the right, we have Jesus getting a tour from his uncle, his great uncle of the British mine operations there in Cornwall. So I think Jesus went there when he was 15, and I'm pretty sure he went there again when he was about 19, 20. The first time was to get a tour of the mining operations. I'm sure Joseph had some assumptions of, oh, these boys are going to inherit this trade, from me. Um, Not maybe understanding Jesus's mission entirely. But again, when he was 20, I think Jesus went back here to study, particularly study, and we'll talk about that in a minute. After the crucifixion, Joseph of Arimathea gets captured by the Sanhedrin, thrown in prison, because he gave Jesus his family tomb. Now, they couldn't stop him from giving Jesus his family tomb, but after the fact, they sure were upset. And a member of the Sanhedrin can't betray the rest of the council without repercussions. They throw him in prison. um, just reading from our book, chapter 16, called After the Crucifixion, in the book Hidden Stories of Jesus in Britain. It says Joseph of Arimathea was arrested, taken from the sanctuary of the synagogue in Jerusalem, and placed in a prison cell with no windows. The dominant Sanhedrin leaders, the fanatical Sadducees, had been enraged by Joseph's request for the body of Jesus. They'd expected his body to be relegated to a burial in the common graveyard of convicted criminals. Joseph of Arimathea would be made to pay for the violation of this custom. As it happened, he and Jesus shared one thing in common that week. They were both arrested by the same people within a couple days of each other. Reports of a rolled away stone, an empty tomb, and terrified guards sent Annas and Caiaphas racing back to the cell of Joseph of Arimathea to find out what part he had played in the rapidly now expanding resurrection hoax. However, when they arrived at the prison, Joseph was missing. Caiaphas immediately sent out messengers to locate Joseph and soon learned he was back in Arimathea. They were shocked. How did Joseph escape prison? In the apocryphal account known as History of Joseph of Arimathea, it is reported that the resurrected Jesus, along with the converted, crucified, and now resurrected thief, appear to him in his cell and enable his escape. So it's a remarkable story. I'll stop there. It keeps going of Joseph of Arimathea after the crucifixion. But what does happen is a hunt begins for all of the family of Jesus. The Sanhedrin is committed to just erasing that this ever happened, who these people are. Christianity is growing after the death of Jesus. They think that it's his family that's spreading it, along with his apostles, and they are out for blood. So let's take a break and talk about the brothers of Jesus during this time a little bit. We have James, the oldest. He was also known as James the Just in history. He was the older brother of Jesus, and he was appointed by the Christian church, the early Christian church, and the apostles to be the first bishop there in Jerusalem. And James was one of a kind. He was the absolute perfect adherent to the law of Moses, and he was the absolute perfect Christian. He kept the laws on both sides just 'cause. And the reason why is hard to know, but everybody in Jerusalem, like the entire city, respected the heck out of James the Just because he was perfect. Whether you were a Christian or a Jew, in fact, any of the sects of Jew, the different religious flavors of it, he had respect from them. And so the Sanhedrin had one heck of a time trying to get rid of this guy, James the Just, because it just outrage would just explode throughout the whole city if they just executed him. Eventually, push comes to shove, and at the top of the temple, probably in debate with him, he gets pushed over the edge and falls to his death. And James the Just becomes one of the first martyrs of the early Christian church. His execution just about destabilized the entire city. And I think within a few decades, that destabilization, excuse me, built up to such a point that we have the Jewish revolts, and the Romans just have to come and ransack the whole city. That's around 70 AD. I think it all began with this guy. So that's the older brother James. Simon, the next oldest brother, there's just no very little evidence of what he did or what happened to him. He's mentioned in the New Testament. He's mentioned in the book of Acts. He's around. We just don't know what he does or what happens. However, Jesus' younger brother, Judas, we do have a lot of apocryphal texts that talk about Judas. And in fact, Judas's name in the scriptures is Thomas. He's the Apostle Thomas. Now you can understand why maybe they wanted to change his name from Judas when they were writing the New Testament, so he's not associated with Judas Iscariot. But Thomas, after being doubting Thomas for the resurrection, he gets assigned to take the gospel to India and to Parthia out east. He has a fantastic mission out there. In fact, once you understand where those documents come from, who translated those, and what bias do we have, which is the ascetic groups out there in the East. Once you remove their bias, which is very much that all material things are evil, including like intimacy and things like that, you can really see the story of Thomas come to life. And it's an amazing story, backed up by all sorts of evidence, archaeological, historical, you name it. The Greeks testify of Christians being in India super early. And we actually are writing a second book, my brother and I and our mother, called Hidden Stories of Jesus Along the Silk Road, where we talk all about the mission of Thomas and what happens to him. I'm not going to talk more about that today, but just a little shout out here, Oak, if you don't mind. We do have a whole nother book series. It's actually book 2 in a series of 5 or 6 books we're working on.
Don't mind at all. I was going to bring it up if you didn't.
Sure. Yeah. We are past halfway writing this book. We're really excited about it. Some amazing stuff out east. I mean, the Nestorian Church, the Church of Persia. I mean, these two places have just libraries and treasure troves of historical records that are worth looking at as long as you understand who wrote them and what they believed. The most important topic, though, regarding, the family of Jesus after the crucifixion is an event known in Christian history as the Exodus of the Faithful. It would not surprise me if nobody's heard of that, and that's fine. I have the sources down there in the bottom left. Essentially, what happens here, it's in the book of Acts. The Christians are convening in Caesarea, that port city, that Roman port city. They're convening in Caesarea around 35, 36 AD, and to convene, to meet together, to counsel together. And some of the most prominent followers of Jesus are going. This includes Joseph of Arimathea, the brothers of Jesus, many of the apostles, including Peter himself, Mary Magdalene, Mary Martha, right? Some of the most well-known proponents of Christianity are meeting in Caesarea. The Sanhedrin catches wind of this. They recognize what happened with James the Just, that they can't just execute these people. It does not go down well for them. If anything, that event galvanized Christian leadership, destabilized that whole city. They also recognize that they're being accused now of murder, which is, of course, against the law of Moses. So they can't make that mistake again. So they come up with a more clever plan this time. And that is they're going to capture these people. They're all meeting in Caesarea. They're going to be in one spot. They can't resist. They're going to raid that house. They're going to capture as many of them as they can. They're going to prep a boat. They're going to strip it of all of its sails. They're going to pull no oars, no nothing. They're going to give them just a stripped boat, load up all these Christians on there and kick them out into the Mediterranean Ocean. And that way they can't be told they know that they're murderers. They didn't kill anybody. They pushed them out there. Nature itself will arrange for what they want to have happen. And that way they can keep their hands clean. And so what they do is, yeah, they exactly that. They capture as many as they can. Peter and others escape. Not everyone is able to escape this raid. And they are kicked out into the Mediterranean Ocean on a boat with no sails or oars. And storms on the Mediterranean Ocean will guarantee their death. I mean, this is a death sentence. It is an execution. Some important people to note, though, we do have the Virgin Mary is reported on this boat, on this ship, Mary Magdalene, Josephus, which I believe is Joseph, the older brother of Jesus. We have Anna, who's called a daughter of Joseph of Arimathea, but likely a sister or half sister of Jesus, something like that. At a minimum, we have Maximum, Lazarus, Cassius, the Roman who pierced the side of Jesus, right? These are some big prominent names that they capture. Cardinal Bronius is recognized as the Catholic Church's one of their best historians ever. And he had access to the Vatican archives, which, as you know, no one outside of a very closed group are allowed to even enter the Vatican archives. But speaking on the year AD 36, Cardinal Bronius said, this is like in the 1500s, that in that year, the party mentioned, which was Jesus's closest disciples, including Joseph of Arimathea, was exposed to the sea in a vessel without sails or oars. The vessel drifted finally to Marseille, and they were saved. From Marseille, Joseph and his company passed into Britain, and after preaching the gospel there, he died. And the source there at the bottom was one of a few other sources that place this event in history. So what we have is probably not, they probably didn't sail all the way to Marseille, France. That's really far to sail without sails or oars. This is probably a quick summary of what happened. What really happened looked more like this, where all they needed to do was get to Egypt. Of course, Joseph of Arimathea, connected throughout the world, had connection in all these ports. So as long as they made it to Egypt, they could get outfitted with the proper ships and make it. And you can see number 7 there is Marseille. And then they would cross over, headed towards, of course, the safest place that Joseph of Arimathea, the leader of this band, the safest place he knows of, away from the Romans, away from the Jews, to protect who he had, was in Britain. In 36 AD, they have a major rendezvous in Gaul in Marseille, which is, Gaul anciently is the same area as France. And from our book, it says, as they learned of the crucifixion of their Lord, many Druids rushed to Gaul to meet up with Joseph, who they knew, and his fellow travelers, and hear firsthand accounts of what had happened to them in Jerusalem. So here we have Joseph of Arimathea and Mary Magdalene meeting with Druidic leadership in Gaul, where Celtic influence was first had. A lot of sources on this rendezvous here. Likely the apostle Philip met them there also, as he was the apostle assigned to France and to Spain in that region. And then they're on to the shores of Britain after crossing safely with an escort of Druidic leadership. They cross the English Channel and they're met by this fierce-looking guy this is a fantasy representation, Oak, of a man named Bron the Blessed. He was a Celtic king of the British heartland, later became Archdruid. This picture makes him look pretty awesome. I like to picture him looking this awesome because we and him share a name, which I'm not named after him. It just so happens writing this book, we discovered that, maybe this is where my name comes from, is this guy, Bron the Blessed. from really early days of Celtic Britain. But he meets them. He makes sure that they're escorted safely. Of course, he's connected, if not related directly to Joseph of Arimathea, as their two kingdoms of their two families were neighboring kingdoms. Bron comes probably from the Welsh heartland, the Silurian kingdom, and just south of that is Cornwall and where the mines are. I'll give an overview of this relationship of Joseph of Arimathea and Bron. His Joseph of Arimathea's daughter Anna actually ends up marrying Bron, the Blessed, and they have kids, which includes a character named Caractacus or Caraticus. That's his Roman name. And then we have a cousin on the other side, a man named Arviragus. And these are going to be important figures that we're going to talk about here later on. And it goes on and on, but this is the extended family of the Holy Family through marriage, through Joseph of Arimathea, but also directly from the relationship of Joseph and Saint Anna. All right, so these are
Bron.
parents, great uncle of Jesus. Yeah, go ahead, Oak.
Yeah, you've got under Caractacus, King of Wales, and Pendragon of Britain against Rome. So I don't, I mean, the only Pendragon I know is Uther Pendragon from the King Arthur
Yeah,
fame. So is Pendragon a surname, or is that like what is a Pendragon? Maybe it's just a title. I'm not familiar.
great question. No, Pendragon is a title. It's a title. The term Pendragon actually predates the Arthurian legends and Uther. Bron the Blessed, for example, was considered Pendragon, and Caractacus. Now, the role Pendragon only comes into play if the collective clans or kingdoms of the British Celts are in jeopardy or there's threat of war. The clans would come together and they'd elect one of the kings to be the king of kings, the Pendragon.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
cool.
We can
Thanks.
we can break down that word further, but I don't think we necessarily need to.
No, that's
Uther
helpful.
gets that name because of the Saxon invasion. Uther was assigned the British general position or the Pendragon position, so he gets the name Uther Pendragon.
Thanks.
Yep. And later Arthur, of course, who picks up that battle, King Arthur, also Pendragon at some point. Now, these people, they had their own temple site. And I want to circle back to this to connect this back to what we're talking about with the ancient Druids, of course. They had this place it's called Mount Tor today, which was a temple site of the Druids. It was a seven-tiered maze or labyrinth, not maze, labyrinth. Difference between maze and labyrinth is that a labyrinth is just a continuous path. There's no like tricking you going this way or that way. Um, and it's important because those familiar with the Ancient Tradition podcast will find a lot of things jump out here. But it's a path of up and downs. But in the Druid ceremony, at the top of the mountain held a representation of the Tree of Life. And in Arthurian legends, the top of this mountain had an apple tree grove. Interesting. Which is supported by Arthurian legends. The state of Grover apple trees was up there. The site symbolized the connection between the three worlds, the underworld, the middle world, and the heavenly world. It also was a connection point to God, and to enter the Tor was to enter the mysteries of God. The seven paths held reference to the world tree or the tree of knowledge, and symbolized the path that every initiate must take to understand the Druidic order and their role in it. The idea was that initiates could reflect back on whatever he or she needed to do to elevate themselves to the next level of understanding. For it was a journey of self-improvement and seeking life answers. Symbolically, the journey from life, from birth to a spiritual awakening to death and the eternity beyond. The Tor was also appointed to be apart from the world. It was separated by marshlands or by a lake. In ancient times, sea levels were a little higher. It's very likely that this area was submerged a little bit more than it is today. It required initiates to cross the water to reach it, and thus the appropriateness of it being an island of sorts, at least. Francis Howard Gordon, researcher of the Tor and of ancient Druidic practices, states that Apples were associated then with divinity and with a Western paradise where the sacred apple tree is guarded by the serpent or the dragon. Reaching the top was symbolic of the ancient notion of gnosis, or the realization of the true nature of God, his creation, and the cosmos. So they had a fantastic temple site here, um, very similar to the ancient Hebrew temple practice. They would perform their ceremonies at the top there. And when Joseph of Arimathea and his group arrive, they go to the same location nearby where Jesus actually had taken up residence at the age of 20. Jesus had stayed in a little hut to study there near that temple site. And Joseph of Arimathea takes his group to that same hut, and on top of where Jesus had lived for a time, he builds this temple site. And this is a rendition of, or an artistic rendition of what that site probably looked like. But it had 12 huts for each of the 12 most prominent disciples that were there with him, and then a central hut built where Jesus had lived that was their inner sanctuary, their temple. I don't know if anyone here has read, oh, I forgot the name of that book. It's the Prophecies of the Last Days, and he has like revelation of what the temple in Missouri might look like, and it's described as circular and has 12 houses, 12 buildings around the center building. I thought that was a fascinating connection, one that's just kind of wild. Um, but centuries later, in fact, a millennia later, in 1086 AD, when William the Conqueror conquers this region, this site where this temple is built was still known then as the Domus Dei, or the House of God. It's referenced right there in the ledger. This region, Domus Dei, the quote there at the bottom underneath the source is the Domus Dei in the great monastery of Glastonbury called the Secret of the Lord. This Glastonbury church possesses in its own villa 12 hides of land which have never paid tax. So over 1,000 years, this site that gets established by Joseph of Arimathea still recognizes the house of God, tax exempt privileges and all. Now, this site, you can see, here's a rendition of the two temple sites that were very close together. We have Mount Tor on the right, and just down the road is Glastonbury Abbey, where the original church was built. And these are very prominent Jesus sites. Having traveled there ourselves, my brother Ben especially, it's an amazing place to be. There's such a different kind of spirit there. Worth checking out. Eventually, this site, over the centuries, gets built into a massive, massive cathedral type abbey. And it holds a massive library. And this library included a bunch of writings that originated with the ancient Druids and their patriarchal beliefs, right? Their Law of Moses style books of scripture. It includes scriptures that came over from Egypt through Phoenician trade routes. It contained ancient Zoroastrian writings, ancient Hebrew records. It probably had writings of Pythagoras and his teachings, which is an interesting connection worth talking about, reading in our book. And also, with Joseph of Arimathea and the followers with him come writings that are New Testament writings from the apostles of Jesus that they themselves carried. These writings, of course, never make it to the Council of Nicaea. They're never heard of in European Christianity for hundreds of years, but they were kept secret and kept safe here in Britain. Within a few decades, I would say, the Roman Empire views the British independency as a rivalry and something worth conquering. So Emperor Claudius initiates the conquest of Britain, and the church has just getting started. It's a few decades old, and now the entire countryside is under siege. Christianity had spread brilliantly in the ancient Celtic world. Bron the Blessed himself being baptized by his cousin Joseph of Arimathea. Almost all of the Western clansmen and their kings get converted. Christianity spreads like wildfire in the British Isles and spreads into Gaul even, and then gets totally smashed by the Roman invasion. I mean, they're just shoving it right back. And of course, Claudius and his follower Nero, the runner-up emperor after Claudius is Nero. These two guys are extremely anti-Christian. I mean, they slaughtered countless Christians, including prominent Romans who convert in the city of Rome. And so they're on a mission to exterminate Christianity as much as conquer Britain. So the British are in hot waters. They're in a tight spot here. Now, what's interesting to note is that the British and their new conversion to Christianity and their newfound faith absolutely flock and throng to the region of Glastonbury to protect it. And this is something that you've got to wear your religious lens for. The historians, they don't see this, they overlook it because of the religious nature of the history. But us, especially members of the Church of Jesus Christ, we can put our religious lens on and see why they flocked to this region and why the Pendragon, to protect Britain, is ruler of this region, is because they want to protect their country, their family, their children, their rights, their liberties, and their religion and their God. And these are their sacred lands, their holy site. Massive war breaks out. The Romans really never are able to really push through to this region. Now, other common maps show the Romans, historians really loosely draw lines of Romans conquered this far. This bubble, no, they did not. They did not break this bubble here. And going back to these two characters, Craticus and Arviragus, these are the vanguards, the guardians of the holy site there in Glastonbury. We have Craticus, who gets appointed Pendragon of Britain, and Arviragus, who's assigned to specifically protect the Hides of Glastonbury, the 12 lands given to Joseph of Arimathea and his company. And in front of Glastonbury, we have Cadbury Hill Fort. It's within eyesight of Glastonbury Tor there in the background. And this is their final hold, their final stronghold to prevent the loss of their religion, the loss of their freedom to worship their God. And they invest and they spare no expense in protecting this site. The Romans throw everything they have at Britain. They're never able to quite crack Cadbury Hill Fort. They're never able to quite crack Cornwall or Wales, although Wales they do kind of kick some butt in Wales and it's a rough go, but this site they're able to hold on to. And it's very reminiscent to me of the Book of Mormon war chapters and holding the Lamanites to the south to protect their the city of Moroni and stuff that's in the north where their temple is and things like that. And I really do think Caractacus, going back here, and Arviragus really parallel like Captain Moroni, Helaman in a lot of ways, having this joint effort. In fact, Tacitus, the Roman historian, said our armies were repeatedly put to rout by the Silurs or Arviragus alone, which reminds me very much of Helaman and his army. Now, a few centuries later, we have the Saxon invasion, very similar story. And this is the time of the historian Gildas, who's one of the most important historians as to what's going on in this region. You may be wondering, why am I talking about this? Because that library of Glastonbury is important. It's where some very important texts were preserved through the Holy Family directly. And I do believe that some of these texts are preserved today. And it's thanks in large to these groups that protect this site over the years. Now, the Saxon invasion was quite an unfortunate event. The Britons were losing Roman protection. The Romans were being pulled in different directions at this point. They actually recruited the Saxons to help them fight off the Picts to the north, the Gaels in Ireland, who were threatening to just completely overrun the entire island. They bring the Saxons over. The Saxons, who are battle-hardened, make quick work of the Picts. They turn around and they see a beautiful landscape of the British Islands, fertile farmland, temperate climates, very wealthy, prominent people, and they decide that they're not going to leave. They're just going to take it. Again, I want to point out this bubble right here of Glastonbury that's overlooked historically. Put on a religious lens, we can see there's a bubble right here where the Britons fight tooth and nail to preserve. And this is around the time of King Uther and Arthurian legend. And all the Arthurian legends take place in this region. They're all in Cornwall, right around this area. Eventually, the Saxons overtake the area. Um, Gildas reports that it's due to the country's wickedness. The Celtic church is just not what it was anymore. Their righteousness does not hold out. They do not have God's favor, and they're overrun. Centuries passed, and the abbey is still in place. The library is still there. The Saxons do not just completely destroy this place. It does survive. Eventually, get the rise of Christianity, and the Roman Catholic Church makes their push over into Britain. And this site is always recognized as a sacred site worth preserving by Roman Catholics, you name it, until it falls into the control in the hands of the Knights Templar. This is around 1100 AD or so. So we're fast forwarding really fast now, Oak. But the Knights Templar take up the protection or the assignment to protect this abbey, and they love it because of all the connections to the temple and the temple teachings that they love. And as members of the church, we know that they had some version of the temple protocol, the temple ceremony. But unfortunately, the Knights Templar are a corrupt group. They're an apostate group, and they start to alter these records significantly. And when we see these records, they come to us very much with a Knights Templar bias. And if we can see that for what it is and peel it back, that's going to be very helpful for us to understand what these records say. Around, so yeah, they mess with these records. Around 1184, King Henry II decides that these Knights Templar are corrupt and apostate even for him, and he has the entire abbey burned to the ground because the Templars have just corrupted it in his mind. They've completely corrupted it. They've staked it out as a stronghold. There's nothing left to do than to completely just burn the place to the ground and kick them out. Around 1184, what we have is a portion of the library preserved by the hands of fleeing Knights Templar who are trying to escape the grasp of King Henry II, and they flee north to Scotland. Here's a picture of the abbey of what it looks like today. It's a massive place. I mean, just huge, enormous. And the rough timeline looks like this. We have the formation of Glastonbury Library in 37 AD by Joseph of Arimathea. 500 years later or so, we have complete Celtic apostasy and the Saxons take over. The Knights Templar are put in charge of Glastonbury Abbey to protect it. We have the burning. We have the remnants of the library that show up in Scotland. And then the next time history sees it is my uncle Glenn Kimball actually works with a group out of New Zealand who claim to have a portion of this remnant that was preserved by the Knights Templar, and he helps bring it to life and to publish it for the world back in 1992. But again, the key to understanding this is that background of the Holy Family, right? To understand where did this text come from? A loose timeline here is Glastonbury, controlled by the Templars. They run away to Scotland. We're not sure, what's happening with it, but eventually it leaves Scotland. It arrives in London by the hand of Freemasons. And as you know, Freemasonry is a group that formed out of the Knights Templar beliefs. And evidence that the Freemasons got a hold of this should be in the temple practice and protocols the Freemasons were practicing. And as members of the church, we know what that looks like, and why Joseph Smith was intrigued by Freemasonry at one point. This group eventually moves these documents to a secret group called the Hope Trust in New Zealand in more recent times, where my uncle Glenn Kimball makes a connection, uncovers these documents, and encourages them to publish. He actually got in hot water with the Hope Trust because he attempted to publish a little sooner than they wanted. But he did work with them on getting it put together. So I do want to share some insight from this book with you guys today, just some excerpts. We have more excerpts in our own book to share, but I want you guys to just look at the fruits of this work, decide for yourselves, what does this look like? I've got a link down here from Graham Hancock, who talks about this book and why it really does seem to connect with history and be a legitimate source. Unfortunately, we do not have the original text. All the Hope Trust group had was transcriptions of what the text was. And of course, they had already come through the hands of the Knights Templar. So we have to undo that bias as we read them. But I want to share with you some of these texts. Now, these texts I'm going to share with you are New Testament. They're the words of Jesus, supposedly, to various people during his ministry in Jerusalem. First one, title Being Overworked. And there's the reference there in the Colburn Bible itself. Do you always keep your bow bent, the string under stress? Poses the question from Jesus. Of course not, replied the huntsman. To do so would be foolish, for the bow would become useless were it not unbent from time to time. Jesus said, the bowman strings his bow before he shoots, and when the shooting is over, he unstrings it. A bow kept always strung will break and be useless when needed. So it is with a man. So it is with a man who never relaxes. He is ever taut within, and when the testing time comes, his stomach turns to water. Another one about nobility. Nobility is an attribute of the soul, and no man has this by right of birth. Nobility demonstrates an ability to live and act according to the highest principles. It is expressed in deeds, outlook, and bearing, in the manner of life and relationship with others. That which ennobles a man is his recognition of something to love and strive for outside of himself. Nobility is the subordination of self to principles. Live your lives in the world as men who journey through a strange land, marveling at its wonders, tasting its pleasures, but ever on guard against dangers. For undue love of the world is a doorway to evil. There are those who derive pleasure in being what they are not, but as their hair turns gray, they suffer sorrow and frustration. Be ever true to yourselves and to your natures. And the last one I want to share, prophecy of the end times. And I have just like a third of it here. It's well worth looking at. We have it in our book. A Roman soldier who hailed from Gaul spoke up. Tell me, good master, when shall the end be? And Jesus answered, take it, Norton or Oak. These are at least as old as 1992, assuming my uncle and these people completely fabricated this 1,000-page book. more likely they are ancient origin. Jesus answered, there will be an end to the beginning, and men will know this by the spirit of the times. Men will no longer be as brothers, nor will they be manly. Women will be as men, and men as women. Adultery will not be condemned, nor will fornication. Therefore, these will flourish. Men will not honor their homelands, and there will be no discrimination among them. Fathers will not be honored, nor mothers respected, and children will be raised to be wayward. Perversions will be encouraged, and criminals will mock the law. And it goes on again for 2 or 3 times this. Just wrapping this up to bring this back, most of what you saw in the presentation today can be found in our book with more detailed sources and citings. We have over 200 cited sources throughout this book. I encourage everyone, go to this site, hiddenstoriesofjesus.square.site. Go check it out. We have some of the text up on that site, some pictures from our journey to Britain itself. We talk a lot about the different topics that it will cover. It's, I think, well worth your time. So, Oak, that pretty much wraps me up. I am ready for any questions you might have.
Awesome.
The audience.
Thanks so much, Bron. That is super interesting. I mean, anything we can learn about Christ that comes from the gaps and his life is just so fascinating to me. There's just so little that we have. And so to see, records and things you've put together, and your Uncle Glenn has put together so much information that is so fascinating to contemplate. And I do have some questions for you.
Okay.
And for anybody else that's watching, feel free to drop a question. Just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and drop your question in there. So, Bron, the first one I'll just mention, a few slides ago, you mentioned the bowstring analogy, Christ talking to a hunter. And it reminded me, Joseph Smith once said, if a man has a bow and keeps it constantly strung tight, it will soon lose its spring. very, very similar to that. So I thought that was really interesting because, uh,
Wow, I did not make that connection, but you're right. Wow.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously bows have been around for a long time, but it's just interesting that both had that same analogy. So, my first question for you is going way back in your presentation to the Council of Nicaea, when you mentioned that there were texts presented there, and they kind of voted on, well, what are we going to include? What are we not going to include? They didn't have access to all texts. So I'm wondering if there is a record of which, and I don't know if you know this, but is there any kind of record of what texts they had access to that they said no to?
That is a good question. I know of a few and a lot of pretty much every apocryphal text, New Testament apocryphal text, almost all of them were at the council and were rejected. That's in summary.
Okay.
But not all of them, but almost. An exact list, that's a good question. I'd have to look that up. I'm not sure what the exact list is, but
It would just be interesting to see, like, here's the texts that they rejected, but here's other texts that weren't there at the council for them to even consider. Um, there's so many texts out there, like you mentioned.
there's an interesting one. It's called the Sunni document. It was discovered somewhat recently, I think the 1800s or something. And it's actually the 29th chapter of the book of Acts. Ancient text, ancient document. Never made it to the Council of Nicaea, was not known to those bishops. Um, there's there's different stories of different texts all over the place, but that one I find particularly interesting that they didn't even have the complete book of the book of Acts.
Yeah. Hmm. Okay, another question. ESUS, ESUS, which is very close to Jesus. How old are the texts that mention that name?
So the texts primarily come to us from the early hundreds AD, hundreds of years after the people they're describing. I don't think there are any original texts beyond maybe the Kolbrin that survive detailing exactly what those people did. We have to infer it through archaeology. We have to infer it through what their enemies were saying. The Romans being one of those sources, the Greeks being another one, the Phoenicians being another one. Um, because the Druids and the Celts at large, they literally believed in not writing things down because they viewed that as a crutch to committing it to memory. They were all about memorization. They're all about stories. They were huge on stories and analogies. In fact, you could say that they taught almost exclusively in parables,
Hmm.
which is one of the things we point out of Jesus comes up with this style of teaching parables that's just blowing the minds of these people in Judea. They've never heard of this. They've never seen teaching like this before. And I think he probably got it from his study with these people in Britain, with among the Druids.
Yeah, interesting. Um, okay, one of the things you mentioned was the Temple of Jerusalem was a moneymaker for the Romans. And I
Yeah,
know just briefly a little about that, but can you explain a little bit more about that for people?
sure. So Judea was, prior to the port of Caesarea being built, was the connection hub of the Roman Empire and the Mediterranean Ocean to the trade routes of the East, the Parthians, the Indians, the Chinese, all of those people. And so not only was it a frequent passage route, but it was a tourist site because of the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, the fame of the temple was worldwide. Everyone would come to Jerusalem to see it. And they would also conduct their trade. It was kind of a two for one. So it was a money maker machine for sure. And the Romans understood this. They gave like delegated control to the of the temple to the Sadducees because the Sadducees could be corrupted and were making money for themselves and the Romans. The whole regime there was pretty corrupt. Caiaphas, Annas, Herod, all these guys. But yeah, it was the trade hub.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I've got a couple of questions here that have come in from listeners. Um, Brad asked a question about what language were the original texts from the Kolbrin Bible written, who translated them into English. So just sort of like you kind of gave the genealogy of, how the Kolbrin got passed down. Is there also a language? Like, what was the original language there um,
Yeah.
in the
So
day?
if I could go back in this timeline even farther, which I didn't bother to in this presentation, but the original text is known as the Bronze Book, and there are versions of the Kolbrin that are just the Bronze Book. And in fact, there are ancient Egyptian texts that parallel the Bronze Book, which is one of the evidences of it being a legitimate work. The original language of the Bronze Book was Egyptian, very similar to the Book of Mormon, which was Reformed Egyptian. It was an Egyptian text, got carried by Phoenician traders to Britain. They had a copy of it. The Druids had a copy of it at the request of the Egyptian priests. BC period, probably 500 BC or older.
Hmm.
A lot of texts were Celtic and were Old Celtic or Old Gaelic languages. And that makes up a small portion. And then there's a huge chunk that's the New Testament portion, which is all in Greek.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
Brett also asks, you mentioned records stored in the Vatican, which very few have access to. Do we know whether the Vatican has any record of the departure of the Holy Family and where they escaped after the death of Christ?
Yeah, so the Vatican, according to Cardinal Baronius, has records talking about it. Let me go back to where that slide was. This one. Um, Cardinal Baronius was the curator of the Vatican archives. Now, the Catholic Church just never pulls out these original texts. They don't want anyone to see them for whatever reason. Even today, no one's allowed to see these texts. But I do have here the Jewish Encyclopedia under Arles talks about the arrival in Arles, which is near Marseille. And then we have a New Testament Apocrypha book called The Recognitions of Clement that talk about the exodus of the faithful um, and the congregating Christians there in Caesarea, which is also verified in the Book of Acts, and how they were captured. So that's about as strong as the evidence that we have. And then there's the Celtic traditions stating that it happened, which are many. I couldn't list them here.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk for a sec about what you've got coming. You've got the Silk Road that's
Yeah.
in process right now. And do you want to tease what's coming after that? You mentioned like 5 or 6 books in the series.
Yeah, we have all the books outlined, which ones we want to talk about. And the third book is actually has a draft, a very rough draft, and that's Hidden Stories of Jesus in Egypt. Here's some fantastic stories of Jesus as a child there in Egypt. Very young child. We're talking toddler up to like age 5 or something.
Hmm.
Um, and there's some fascinating politics and things that happen with the church, after the crucifixion there in Egypt, and some remarkable stories that are well worth looking at that most of Christianity and Christian scholars cast aside as heretical nonsense. The Gnostics in particular, granted to them, the Gnostics went super apostate within a few hundred years. I mean, they went way off the rails. But when you look at their oldest texts, the Nag Hammadi text, for example, there are some serious nuggets of insight and truth that come through that. And again, if you understand the Gnostic worldview and bias, you can peel back some of that and really get a good look at what these people believe. And I think they had really old New Testament documents talking about the relationship of Jesus to Peter, the relationship of Jesus to Mary Magdalene, these kind of stuff.
You've mentioned a few times about peeling back the belief system of a group like the Gnostics or the
Yeah.
Templars. Can you give an example of like, and I know I'm just kind of catching you, at the end of your
No, go for it.
presentation,
I
you
got
got,
an example already. I
oh,
have.
perfect. Yeah, give an example of like what has been published, peel back their layer, and then like what's the underlying truth, if you can do that.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back over here to the Silk Road and the Apostle Thomas there on the right. So the apocryphal works of Thomas are totally cast out by Christian scholars because they think it's total heresy and blasphemy, some of the things that it talks about in there. Scholars Secular scholars are not so quick to throw it out, though, and for good reason. And Christian scholars who want to take it serious don't throw it out so quickly. In fact, I have one of those authors here. Christianity, oh, it's backwards, it's mirrored, but guy
Oh,
named
I can read it.
Samuel Moffat, um, brilliant author, non-LDS, right? So the apocryphal works of Thomas, we have the Acts of Thomas, we have the Gospel according to Thomas. There's four or five of them. Um, they get cast out because of their anti-material worldview, which is a Gnostic and ascetic mindset. The ascetics believed that you had to like deny yourself of all pleasure in this life if you wanted to be, saved. They're very similar to the to like Buddha and Buddhism out there, where Buddha survived off 1 grain of rice or whatever. They're very anti-intimacy in marriage, like extreme. Like that was indulging in the world, and the world is all evil. All of creation is evil. All matter is evil. Spirit is the only thing that's good, and you have to deny yourself of your body to achieve your spirit. Right? That's their belief. And these apocryphal writings of Thomas come to us through this group. So when you read the Gospel of Thomas, for example, it talks about this king in India whose wife, the queen, gets converted under Thomas's teachings. And what it says in Thomas's apocryphal work is that she incurs the wrath of her husband, the king, because she no longer will be intimate with him. Right. And she's denied herself of all worldly indulgences. And that's what sparks the king's anger and frustration. He goes out and he actually attempts to kill Thomas. But then you go to the Indian traditions themselves, and they do have some written records in India of Christianity and how it was preached and the same story. And the Indian version is totally different. This king gets upset because Thomas's preaching is unraveling his influence over his people, and his nobles are particularly losing influence, and they're pushing him to execute Thomas. All right, and that's why he goes after Thomas. There's no mention of the queen or her, celibacy and stuff like that. And so the bias just became very clear. The whole story was the same, but you remove that bias from it, and you have what's likely the real story.
Yeah, but it's almost like you have to have multiple accounts through different lenses to kind of
That's right.
decode that.
Yes. Yes.
Hmm.
Every apocryphal work, if it's going to be handled responsibly, has to be cross-referenced with other source material. If you
Hmm.
can't cross-reference it, it's hard to know if you're looking at bias or not. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Um, thanks. Okay, so let's jump back. I want to talk a little about your Uncle Glenn, just let you kind of finish with this.
Yeah.
Several years ago, I don't remember how I first heard his name, but I started to listen to a number of uh, radio shows mostly that he was on, like Coast to Coast AM. There's a collection on YouTube that I found, and I listened to probably 70 hours worth of, him talking at different times. It was so fascinating. Everything from a different take on the nativity story that I thought was, I mean, it was completely mind-blowing to even contemplate, like, okay, could this have really been how the nativity story went? Because it's not what's in the Bible in significant ways. And then just so many other things. It was so fascinating to listen to his stories and his, he said that there's like 5 million documents about Jesus around the world. And it was kind of his goal, I guess, in some respect, to catalog and organize that. And he had his Kimball University online, which by the time I learned about him was offline, because I think he'd maybe passed away by that point.
Yeah.
But can you just talk a little about him and just give a brief bio for people who want to understand, like, who's the guy kind of that started this ball rolling, and then you guys kind of picked it up.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my Uncle Glenn. Sorry, it's going to get me tear up a little bit. Um, he died in 2010 due to liver failure, which is a common Kimball family condition. And with his death in 2010, all his work basically dropped. He was partnering with his son Chase, but Chase couldn't keep it up on his own. He had a Hollywood producer, John Fassett, who couldn't keep it up on his own either. But yeah, he would get on talk shows, like you said, Coast to Coast AM, that would normally bring in 200,000, 300,000 listeners, which is a lot. It's a lot for a good talk show. But at his peak, Glenn would get on as a guest and he pull in two, three, sometimes up to 5 million, I think was the most he ever pulled in listeners concurrently. I mean,
Mm.
he knew how to bring in a crowd, and I wish I could tell stories like he does. You said it. You could listen to him for hours and hours. He's just a brilliant storyteller. The way he inflects his voice and tone is just it's masterful. And I'm not there, but he would say things that would, yeah, that would drop people's jaws, of course. Like, here's what the nativity story probably really looked like. And I want to jog your memory a little bit, Oak, and remind you that actually his version of nativity did not take away from the actual events in the scripture nativity. It just says, hey, here's what happened first, then that happened, then this. And what happened first is just not in the canon scripture. But it wasn't hey, the nativity was this and not this. It was he was never like that, but he would always add context, and he was brilliant at piecing a lot of these things together. Um, yeah, so he started the Kimball University. He made over 143 audio lectures, each one of them about an hour long. I've had the privilege of getting just about all of them. I think I have 141 of the original audio lectures on CD. I've tried to transcribe a lot of them digitally, but it's hard. Some of them are scratched and stuff. I just have to like massage the CD and pray that it'll successfully convert to digital format. But yeah, some other people have been doing similar thing. I think Regal Beagle on YouTube is a huge Glenn fan because he has like 20 or so of his audio lectures up. And I think that's what you were talking about.
Yeah.
But Glenn was a masterful puzzle piece and jigsaw puzzle solver in terms of history and the fragmented pieces of history you could find. He knew how to make connections better than almost anybody I could say. And a lot of what we've discovered was pioneering off of his work for sure. He was a springboard for us. I think a lot of what we have in our book goes above and beyond what he had researched in his life. Um, yeah, he was a brilliant historian.
Yeah. Well, I loved his stuff. And, if anybody wants to find him, you can just look up Glenn Kimball on YouTube and find some of these old radio episodes. He'd talk about lots of different topics. It was super fascinating.
Fun, and one more fun fact, oh, if you don't mind. His dad, so my grandpa Kimball, Eldon Kimball, was actually one of the church historians. He
Hmm.
curated a massive library of church history for a long time himself personally, and my uncle Glenn would go and help him arrange and organize. And so his introduction to religious history began as a child, right? And it was his life's work. He died um, well, into his grandfather years. Um, and it was just a wealth of knowledge. I wish he was around still. It would be. I didn't really become a fan of his until like 2015, 5 years after he'd passed, because I was on my mission and stuff when he was big. But
Yeah. Hmm. Well, he's missed. There's people that accumulate that kind of knowledge and start passing it on. You can't get enough of it. So I'm glad you guys have picked up the baton and you're doing a great work here and really appreciate you being on today and love what you're doing.
appreciate it. Oh, thank you, and thanks to all your audience who's watching this live and who's going to watch it on VOD. Appreciate it. Appreciate their time.
You bet. Thanks.
Take care.